February 1945, Third Army positions near the Siegfried Line, Germany. A freezing wind cuts through a muddy pine forest, where artillery shells tear the tops off the trees. Freezing mud fills the boots of exhausted men, who have spent 3 continuous weeks in frontline trenches. A single jeep bounces down a rutted supply track far behind the infantry positions. Inside the vehicle sits a fresh military police officer, holding a clipboard with crisp white paper. He is looking for violations of a brand new War Department regulation that just arrived from Washington. He spots a weary soldier leaning against a shattered tree trunk and pulls over to write a citation. The soldier does not move. He is too tired to salute. General George S. Patton is about to discover this citation on his desk, and his response will redefine what it means to lead men in the face of absolute bureaucratic insanity. This is the story of what happened when a frontline sergeant was written up for having his unit insignia on the wrong shoulder while fighting the German army on the Siegfried Line. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show the battle no medal was ever given for. The combat soldier holding the line in that freezing forest was Sergeant Thomas Miller. He was 24 years old, hailed from a small farming community outside Lincoln, Nebraska, and fought with the 90th Infantry Division. Miller had enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor, leaving behind a young wife and a newborn daughter he had only seen in grainy black and white photographs. He had survived the bloody hedgerows of Normandy, the brutal artillery duels of the Falaise Pocket, and the freezing nightmare of the Ardennes. 2 weeks prior, a piece of shrapnel had sliced open his left forearm, but he had bandaged it himself with dirty gauze so he could stay with his depleted squad. By February, he was thin, hollow-eyed, and covered in a thick layer of engine grease and frozen mud. He had not slept in a real bed or eaten a hot meal in 21 days, and his hands were too raw and stiff from the sub-zero temperatures to grip a needle. The military police officer who pulled over his jeep was Lieutenant Arthur Vance. He was 26 years old, came from an affluent neighborhood in Boston, Massachusetts, and served with the 512th Military Police Company. Vance had never seen the flash of an enemy muzzle or heard the whistle of an incoming mortar shell, having spent the entire war assigned to administrative duties and secure rear area supply hubs. His uniform was wool, dry cleaned, and tailored perfectly to his frame, and his leather boots were polished to a mirror shine that reflected the gray winter sky. Vance believed with absolute certainty that military discipline was not forged in the violence of the foxhole, but in the rigid adherence to standard operating procedures. To him, an unpolished button or a misplaced insignia was a direct threat to the chain of command, a sign of moral decay that had to be corrected immediately. By February 1945, the Allied advance into the German homeland had stalled into a grueling war of attrition along the heavily fortified Siegfried Line. The optimism that had followed the breakout from France months earlier had completely evaporated in the freezing mud of the Rhineland. Supply lines were stretched to the absolute breaking point across hundreds of miles of devastated landscape, forcing divisions to ration fuel, ammunition, and even basic winter clothing. Frontline units were severely depleted, with many rifle companies operating at less than half their normal strength due to mounting casualties and severe frostbite. Divisions were kept in the line for weeks on end, without relief, and the boundaries between organized military camps and the raw chaos of active combat operations became dangerously blurred. In the rear areas, massive administrative hubs had grown into self-contained bureaucratic empires where thousands of troops never heard a shot fired in anger. These sprawling supply centers and command headquarters operated under strict peacetime regulations, completely detached from the brutal realities of the men freezing in the foxholes just a few miles down the road. While division commanders struggled to secure enough artillery shells and clean, dry socks for their men, the administrative apparatus in Washington remained obsessed with uniformity and military appearance. Other high-ranking officers frequently chose to overlook minor infractions, understanding that a soldier with frozen fingers could not be expected to maintain a parade ground standard while ducking mortar fragments. They tolerated the dirt, the mixed uniforms, and the field-expedient modifications because they knew that survival took precedence over any rulebook. But the arrival of a brand-new War Department directive regarding insignia placement completely shattered this tacit understanding between the combat commanders and the rear area staff. The jeep carrying the pristine military police lieutenant bounced through the melting slush, bringing a rigid world of paperwork directly into the path of men who were still wiping the blood of their comrades from their hands. Lieutenant Vance stepped out of his jeep and walked directly toward the trench where the infantrymen were resting. He stopped right in front of the weary sergeant and stared down at him. "You are out of uniform, Sergeant," Vance said. Miller looked up slowly, his eyes bloodshot, his face blackened by soot. "I have been in the line for 3 weeks, Lieutenant," Miller said. Vance pointed a gloved finger at the sergeant's left sleeve. "The new War Department directive states all unit patches must be on the right shoulder," Vance said. "The left shoulder is reserved for the new theater identification insignia." Miller wiped a mix of sweat and dirt from his forehead with the back of his hand. "My squad lost 3 men yesterday, Lieutenant," Miller said. "We have been moving ammunition since midnight." Vance pulled a fountain pen from his pocket and uncapped it. "That is no excuse for a total breakdown in military discipline," Vance said. "Every man in this theater is required to comply with the new regulations immediately." Miller looked down at his stiff, frozen fingers, then back at the pristine officer. "I do not have a needle, Lieutenant," Miller said. "I do not have any thread, and my hands are too cold to sew a patch." Vance did not look at the sergeant's hands, and instead opened his leather portfolio. "Your division commander will receive a copy of this citation for improper uniform regulation compliance," Vance said. Miller stood up slowly, his knees popping in the freezing air. "We are holding off a German counterattack, Lieutenant," Miller said. "The men do not care about patches." Vance began writing on his pad. The paper clean and crisp. "The military runs on regulations, Sergeant. Not on your personal convenience," Vance said. "A disciplined soldier always finds time to maintain his appearance." Miller tightened his grip on his heavy rifle but kept his voice steady. "Route it up then, Lieutenant," Miller said. Vance tore the white sheet from his pad and handed it to the sergeant. "You are officially cited for non-compliance with uniform regulations," Vance said. Miller took the paper, folded it twice without looking at it, and shoved it into his greasy pocket. Vance turned on his heel, walked back to his clean jeep, and told his driver to return to the headquarters. The company commander discovered the ticket in Miller's pocket during an inspection later that afternoon and immediately realized the severity of the insult. He refused to let his best sergeant face a disciplinary board while fighting the enemy and sent the paperwork directly up the chain of command. The formal report detailing the citation reached Patton within the hour. Patton's jeep pulled up to the stone building, housing the military police detachment. 4 stars gleamed on his helmet, and his ivory revolvers rested on his belt. The room went perfectly silent as the general walked in unannounced. He did not look at the clerks who leaped to attention. Keeping his cold eyes fixed straight ahead, Patton studied the military police commander. He took the crumpled citation from his pocket and laid it flat on the desk. "Did your officer write this ticket?" Patton asked. "Yes, General," the commander said. "It was issued for a uniform infraction at the frontline positions this morning." "Did Lieutenant Vance inspect a sergeant from the 90th Infantry Division?" Patton asked. "He did, General," the commander answered. "The sergeant was in direct violation of the new insignia directive." "Had that sergeant been in continuous combat for 3 weeks?" Patton asked. The commander hesitated. "I do not know his operational status, General. We were just enforcing the War Department regulation." Patton stood perfectly still, his hands resting near his side. A sergeant who has been fighting for 21 days was written up because his unit patch is on the wrong shoulder. Patton said, "He has been too busy killing Germans to sew." The military police officer who wrote him up has apparently had plenty of time for professional tailoring. "Your men inspect uniforms in the rear area," Patton said. "They do not inspect patches on men living in muddy foxholes." This Third Army will comply with the uniform change during scheduled rest periods and rear area rotations. No frontline soldier will be inspected for administrative compliance while he is engaged in active combat operations. Patches can be moved when soldiers are no longer being shot at by the enemy. "The regulation is completely valid," Patton said. "The timing remains completely insane. We comply with orders when we are physically able, not when a Washington tailor decides we should. Your officers will focus their attention on securing supply lines, not policing the dress code of exhausted infantry squads." Patton picked up the crisp white citation, ripped it down the middle, and dropped the pieces onto the floor. "You have a choice," Patton said. "Order your men to assist the logistics teams with heavy ammunition loading, or face immediate reassignment to a front-line rifle platoon. Decide now." The commander kept his eyes straight ahead, his face pale in the dim room. "We will report to the supply depot for loading duty immediately, General," he said. The military police commander wasted no time. He issued an immediate radio broadcast to all units stationed across the sector, calling off the targeted uniform inspections and reassigning his entire roster to heavy labor. Within 2 hours, Lieutenant Vance found himself stripped of his clean, dry cleaning duties and standing in the frozen mud of a sprawling division ammunition depot. He watched as truck after truck rolled into the courtyard, their flatbeds piled high with massive wooden crates of heavy artillery shells. Vance had to remove his pristine leather gloves to get a proper grip on the rough, splintered wood. The freezing air stung his bare hands, turning his skin bright red within minutes. He could smell the sharp stench of exhaust fumes, wet canvas, and frozen earth as he lifted the heavy boxes alongside common supply handlers. Strangers and passing truck drivers stared at the immaculate officer covered in grease and sweat as he struggled under the immense physical weight of the war. Witnesses from neighboring combat units laughed openly when they saw the polished lieutenant carrying ammunition box after ammunition box until his arms trembled from pure exhaustion. There were no clipboards, no fountain pens, and no clean sheets of paper left in his hands. Every muscle in his body ached as he was forced to spend the rest of that bitter winter night physically supporting the very men he had tried to penalize for a misplaced patch. Sergeant Thomas Miller survived the remaining months of the European conflict, though he carried the physical and mental scars of the Siegfried line for the rest of his days. When the mobilization orders finally came down after the German surrender, he boarded a cramped troop transport and returned home to Nebraska in late 1945. He walked back onto his family farm, embraced the wife he had left behind, and finally held the daughter, who had previously only existed to him as a creased piece of photographic paper. Miller never spoke to his neighbors or his children about the freezing mud, the artillery barrages, or the military police officer who had tried to penalize his exhaustion. He quietly tended his crops for 4 decades, operating his tractor with hands that remained stiff from winter frostbite, until he died peacefully in his sleep in 1983. Lieutenant Arthur Vance remained with the supply network for the duration of the occupation, though his reputation within the regiment never fully recovered from his night at the ammunition depot. He returned to his comfortable family estate in Boston in 1946, where he joined his father's prosperous accounting firm and lived out a quiet, predictable life. He became a bitter man who spent his evenings complaining about the decline of modern institutional discipline and the breakdown of traditional respect for authority figures. Vance died in 1991, leaving behind a pristine trunk filled with immaculate wartime uniforms that still bore perfectly positioned, unsoiled shoulder insignia. General George S. Patton kept a copy of the uniform dispute in his private files, mentioning the incident briefly in a journal entry, written just weeks before his sudden death. He noted that a true commander must always distinguish between the skin of an army and its core muscle, writing that an army which polices its brave men for Taylor's rules while they are bleeding in the mud is an army that has forgotten how to win a war. Some historians have argued that Patton's flagrant disregard for the War Department's strict uniform directive was a dangerous display of military insubordination that undermined broader institutional authority during a critical phase of the European campaign. They contend that maintaining rigid administrative standards across a theater of war is essential for preventing a total breakdown of Army structure and organizational discipline. Others have argued the opposite, insisting that his swift and decisive intervention was a brilliant example of practical combat leadership that protected frontline morale when bureaucratic overreach threatened to alienate the fighting men. What is certain is that the tactical flexibility of the Third Army remained entirely unbroken. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have accepted the bureaucratic directive to protect institutional uniformity? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the battle no medal was ever given for, make sure to subscribe.